The blood-red sun hung low over Copper Ridge, Arizona territory, painting the dusty main street in shades of rust and amber. October of 1878 had brought an early chill to the high desert, the kind that crept into bones and warned of harder days ahead. Margaret Sutton walked slowly down the wooden boardwalk, her arms wrapped around a heavy basket of supplies from the general store. Flour, coffee, salt pork, the simple necessities of a simple life. She was 42 years old, though the Arizona sun had weathered her face to make her look perhaps a few years more. Her hair, the color of rusty brown, threaded with silver, was pulled back in a severe bun that revealed the strong lines of her jaw. She wore a plain cotton dress in dark blue practical boots and a shawl against the cooling air. To anyone watching, she was simply another widow making her way home after Saturday shopping. Unremarkable, forgettable. But those who looked closely might have noticed certain details. The way her eyes constantly scanned the street, never settling, always measuring distances and angles. The way her right hand, calloused and strong, hovered near the hidden pocket in her skirt where a small folding knife rested. The way she walked with perfect balance weight, distributed evenly, ready to move in any direction without warning. Margaret Sutton had not always been a widow who kept chickens and taught children their letters. Once she had been something else entirely, something the Arizona Territory had tried very hard to forget. The street was quiet as she passed the Silver Dollar Saloon, the assay office, the undertaker's establishment with its fading sign. Most folks had already headed home for supper. The mining operations that had once made Copper Ridge prosperous were playing out, leaving behind empty shaft houses and desperate men. Times were changing. The wild days were supposedly over. 3 riders appeared at the far end of the street, silhouetted against the dying sun. Margaret noticed them immediately, though she gave no outward sign. Her pace did not change. Her eyes did not narrow, but her awareness sharpened like a blade drawn across a whetstone. The riders advanced slowly, fanning out to block the width of the street. Margaret calculated 30 yards, 25. 20. She could turn back, retreat into the general store, but that would only delay the inevitable. And besides, running was not in her nature. She had spent 10 years trying to bury that nature, but some things once forged in fire and blood never truly disappeared. The lead rider was a man of perhaps 50, his face marked by a jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. He wore a dusty gray duster and a wide-brimmed hat, and his eyes held the flat, empty look of a man who had seen too much death to fear it anymore. His name was Dalton Reed, and Margaret knew his reputation even before he opened his mouth. Reed reined in his horse 10 feet from where Margaret stood. The other 2 riders, younger men with nervous hands and hungry eyes, positioned themselves on either side. Escape routes cut off. Standard intimidation tactics. "Mrs. Sutton," Reed said, his voice rough as gravel scraped over wood, "we need to talk about your water rights." Margaret set down her basket carefully, buying herself a moment to think. Her hands remained visible, unthreatening. When she spoke, her voice carried the soft, measured tones of a schoolteacher, nothing more. "I told Mr. Calhoun last week, sir, my land is not for sale." Reed's smile had no warmth in it. "Wasn't asking, ma'am." His hand moved toward his gun belt, not drawing, just a gesture, meant to remind her of the power imbalance. 3 armed men, 1 middle-aged widow. The math seemed simple, but then a voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. "Ma." Margaret's heart clenched. From the alley beside the mercantile, Iris Sutton emerged carrying an armload of split firewood. She was 18 years old, dark curly hair escaping from beneath a simple bonnet. Green eyes bright with intelligence and curiosity. She wore a practical calico dress and sturdy boots, and she moved with the easy confidence of someone who had never truly known danger. Until now. The 2 younger riders moved fast, spurring their horses to cut off Iris's path. One of them, a kid barely 20 with a scraggly beard, grabbed Iris by the arm, sending her firewood clattering to the dirt. She cried out in surprise and anger, and something inside Margaret Sutton shattered. The transformation was instantaneous. The basket of supplies fell from her hands, flour sack bursting in a white cloud. Her right hand moved in a blur of motion, dropping to her boot in one smooth, practiced arc. The small folding knife emerged, opened, and flew through the air in a single, liquid movement. The blade buried itself in Dalton Reed's saddle 2 inches from his thigh, quivering with the force of the throw. Every man froze. Margaret stood perfectly still, weight balanced on the balls of her feet, right hand already reaching for the second knife hidden at the small of her back. Her entire posture had changed. The widow was gone. In her place stood something older, something deadly, something that radiated controlled violence like heat from a forge. When she spoke, her voice had changed too. The soft teacher's accent had vanished, replaced by a harder Western drawl, each word clipped and precise. "Next one goes through your throat, Reed. Let her go." Reed stared at her, his eyes widening as recognition dawned. His hand had moved toward his pistol, but now hung frozen in midair. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "You're not. You can't be." Margaret said nothing. Her eyes, green as bottle glass and twice as sharp, held his without blinking. Reed's voice dropped to something between awe and terror. "Margaret Sutton ain't your real name, is it?" Still, she remained silent, but her hand tightened on the second knife. Reed began to laugh, a sound with no humor in it. "The Iron Rose. Christ almighty, boys, we're looking at the Iron Rose herself. Thought you died in Prescott back in '68. The younger man holding Iris looked confused, but his grip loosened slightly. Iris, her face pale but her eyes defiant, stood very still. "I heard the stories," Reed continued, shaking his head in disbelief. 43 men dead. Best sharpshooter Wells Fargo ever hired. Disappeared after the Prescott incident, and nobody ever found the body. But you didn't die, did you? You just became somebody else." Margaret finally spoke, her voice cold as winter iron. "Let my daughter go, Reed. This is your only warning." Reed glanced at his men, then back at Margaret. Whatever he had come here to do, it was no longer worth it, not against the Iron Rose. Legends died hard in the Arizona Territory, and this particular legend still had all her teeth. He nodded slowly to the young man holding Iris. "Let her go." Iris pulled free, stumbling toward her mother. Margaret caught her with one arm, never taking her eyes off Reed, never lowering her defensive stance. Reed gathered his reins. "Mr. Calhoun will want to know about this. Real interested, I reckon." "You tell Calhoun," Margaret said softly, "that the Iron Rose is retired. Has been for 10 years. But if he or any of his men come near my daughter again, retirement ends. Permanently." Reed touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that might have been respect or might have been mockery. "Ma'am?" He looked at the knife still quivering in his saddle, then decided against retrieving it. Some souvenirs weren't worth the risk. The 3 riders turned and cantered away, dust rising in their wake. Margaret watched until they disappeared around the bend in the road, her body still coiled tight as a spring. Only when they were truly gone did she allow herself to breathe. Her hand dropped from the hidden knife. The tension in her shoulders eased by degrees. She turned to Iris, who stood staring at her with wide eyes and an expression Margaret could not read. "Ma," Iris whispered. "What did he call you?" Margaret retrieved her spilled basket, gathering what supplies had not been ruined. Her hands were shaking now, but whether from fear or the adrenaline draining from her system, she could not say. "Nothing," she said, the soft teacher's voice struggling to return. "Old ghost story. Come on home, sweetheart." But Iris did not move. Her green eyes, so like her father's, searched Margaret's face with an intensity that felt like accusation. "That knife throw," she said slowly. "You said you learned from Pa, but Pa was a clerk in the land office. Where did you really learn that?" Margaret felt the weight of 10 years of lies pressing down on her chest. She had known this day would come, had dreaded it, had planned for it. But no amount of planning could make the truth easier to speak. "Home," she said again, firmer this time. "We'll talk at home." They walked back to the ranch in silence, the setting sun stretching their shadows long behind them. Margaret could feel Iris watching her from the corner of her eye, could sense the questions building like storm clouds. The ranch house, a small but sturdy structure of adobe and timber that Margaret had maintained with her own hands, sat alone on a slight rise overlooking a creek that never ran dry. That water, that precious resource in a land where drought could kill faster than bullets, was what Arthur Calhoun wanted, what he would kill for if necessary. Inside the house, Margaret lit the oil lamps while Iris stood in the doorway, arms crossed, waiting. The familiar space that had always felt safe now seemed too small, too confining. Everywhere Margaret looked, she saw the life she had built. The simple furniture she had made or traded for, the books she used for teaching, the kitchen where she baked bread for church socials, the bedroom where Iris slept under quilts Margaret had sewn, all of it built on a foundation of silence and secrets. "Talk," Iris said, and her voice carried an edge Margaret had never heard before. Now, Margaret stood with her back to her daughter, hands gripping the edge of the kitchen table. She could run, could deflect, could lie again. But Reed knew. And if Reed knew, then Calhoun knew. And if Calhoun knew, the lies were already dead. "Go to the barn," Margaret said quietly. "Under the 4th floorboard from the east wall, there's a tin box. Bring it here." Iris hesitated, then turned and left. Margaret listened to her footsteps crossing the yard, heard the barn door creak open. She used the time to steady herself, to prepare for the moment when her daughter would stop seeing her as Margaret Sutton, widow and schoolteacher, and start seeing her as something else entirely. Iris returned, carrying a battered tin box just blooming at its corners. She set it on the table between them like a challenge. "Open it," Margaret said. Iris lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were newspaper clippings. She unfolded the first one with trembling fingers. The paper was yellowed, fragile, dated 1864. "Iron Rose stops stagecoach massacre. 8 dead bandits." Iris's breath caught. She unfolded another. "Female sharpshooter hired by Wells Fargo. Margaret Rose Thornton fastest gun in the territory." Another. "Prescott incident leaves questions. Iron Rose vanishes. Authorities seek witness." Beneath the clippings was a daguerreotype, the image faded, but still clear. A young woman, perhaps 25, stood in a photographer's studio wearing dark leather vest and riding pants. Twin Colt revolvers hung at her hips in tooled holsters. Her face was harder, leaner than Margaret's now, but unmistakably the same, the eyes especially. Those cold, calculating eyes that had looked down the barrel of a gun at 43 men and never once hesitated. Iris lifted the photograph with shaking hands. "This is you." "Yes." "You killed people?" "I did." Iris set down the photograph and stepped back from the table as though it might burn her. "How many?" Margaret met her daughter's eyes. No more lies, no more hiding. 43 men, over 6 years. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Iris stared at her mother, and Margaret watched her daughter's face cycle through emotions: shock, disbelief, horror, confusion, and finally something that looked like fear. "Who are you?" Iris whispered. Margaret sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs. "My name was Margaret Rose Thornton. People called me the Iron Rose because I could put bullets in targets faster than anyone else, and because I never showed mercy. I worked for Wells Fargo protecting shipments through the territories. Later I hired out as a gun for anyone who needed someone killed and had the money to pay. And my father," here was the second secret, the one that might hurt even more than the first. Margaret reached back into the tin box and pulled out a folded letter, the paper soft from years of handling. She passed it to Iris without a word. Iris unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was masculine precise. The ink faded to brown. "My dearest Rose," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone." Iris read in silence, her eyes moving across the page. Margaret knew the words by heart. She had read them 1,000 times in the dark hours of the night when guilt and grief made sleep impossible. Samuel Garrett, U.S. Marshal. The only man who had ever looked at the Iron Rose and seen something worth saving. They had met during a joint operation, Wells Fargo and the Marshal's office working together to break up a gang operating along the territorial line. Samuel had been different from other lawmen, quiet, thoughtful, more interested in justice than glory. He had courted her with a patience that baffled her, had looked past the guns and the reputation to see the woman underneath, and somehow, impossibly, she had fallen in love with him. They married in the spring of 1860. Margaret kept working, kept wearing her guns, but something had shifted. Samuel never asked her to quit, never tried to change her. but his presence in her life had been like a calm center in a storm, and she had found herself gravitating toward it. 3 months after their wedding, Samuel was killed. The Devereaux gang, running from a failed bank robbery, had opened fire on a passenger train trying to break through a marshal's blockade. Samuel had been on that train trying to evacuate civilians. He took 3 bullets protecting a family of settlers and died before the doctor could arrive. Margaret had been 2 months pregnant. The letter Iris now held had been written the night before Samuel's final assignment. He had a habit of writing such letters, leaving them for Margaret in case the worst happened. This one, like all the others, asked her to choose life over revenge, to choose their unborn child over the hunt. She had ignored him, had tracked the Devereaux gang across 2 territories, systematically eliminating every member until only the leader remained. Thomas Devereaux had died in Prescott in a duel that witnesses said was the fastest draw they had ever seen. The Iron Rose had put 2 bullets through his heart before he cleared leather. But something had broken in her during that final confrontation. She had looked at Thomas Devereaux's body and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no closure, just emptiness. And Iris growing inside her had been the only thing that felt real. Iris finished reading and looked up, tears streaming down her face. "He asked you not to hunt them. He begged you." "I know. But you did it anyway." "Yes." "And then what?" "You just decided to become someone else, to pretend none of it happened." Margaret's voice was steady, though her heart was breaking. "I decided my daughter deserved better than to grow up as the child of the Iron Rose. Better than to spend her life hearing whispers and seeing fear in people's eyes. Better than having her mother hunted by every gunslinger looking to make a reputation. So I came here to Copper Ridge, where nobody knew Margaret Rose Thornton. I became Margaret Sutton, widow of Samuel Garrett, which was true enough. And I raised you." Iris wrapped her arms around herself, and Margaret ached to hold her, to comfort her, but the distance between them felt vast as the desert. "For 18 years, Iris said slowly, you lied to me about who you are, about what you did. I wanted you to have a normal life." "Normal?" Iris's voice rose, anger breaking through the shock. "You think lying is normal? You think hiding 43 deaths is normal?" "I think," Margaret said quietly, "that I did what I thought was best. I'm not asking you to understand. I'm not even asking you to forgive me. But I need you to believe that everything I did for you." Iris looked at the clippings, at the photograph, at the letter from the father she never knew. When she spoke again, her voice was cold in a way that hurt more than anger. "I need time. I can't look at you right now." She turned and walked to her bedroom. The door closed softly. The lock clicked. Margaret sat alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of her former life, and felt the weight of every decision she had ever made crushing down on her shoulders. Night fell over Copper Ridge. Margaret did not light more lamps. She sat in the darkness and thought about Samuel, about the promise she had broken to him, about the life she had lived and the lives she had taken, about the daughter who now looked at her with a stranger's eyes. Somewhere in the house she heard Iris moving around, packing perhaps. Margaret would not stop her if she chose to leave, would not even try. Iris was 18, old enough to make her own choices, old enough to walk away from a mother she no longer recognized. Near midnight there was a knock at the door. Margaret rose stiffly, her hand automatically checking for the knife that was no longer in her boot. She had left both knives on the kitchen table, along with all the other remnants of the Iron Rose. Through the window, she saw Sheriff Owen Cole's weathered face. She opened the door. Cole was 58 years old, gray-haired and gray-bearded, with a limp from an old war wound that never quite healed. He had been sheriff of Copper Ridge for 12 years, and in all that time he had never asked Margaret about her past. She suspected he knew, or at least guessed, but he had chosen silence. Until now. "Maggie," he said, and she noticed he did not call her Mrs. Sutton. "Need to talk. It's about Dalton Reed." They sat at the kitchen table, the newspaper clipping still spread across its surface. Cole glanced at them but said nothing. He pulled out a folded wanted poster and laid it beside the other papers. Dalton Reed, $2,000 reward for murder and robbery across 3 territories. "Reed works for a man named Arthur Calhoun," Cole said. "Railroad developer out of Tucson, buying up water rights all through southern Arizona. Your ranch sits on the last independent aquifer between here and Yuma. I told Calhoun's men the land's not for sale." "I know." Cole hesitated, then pulled out a second piece of paper. This one was older, more worn. A wanted poster from 1868, the ink faded to brown. "Thomas Devereaux, gang leader, murder, robbery, assault, $5,000 reward." Margaret stared at the poster. The face that stared back at her was one she saw sometimes in nightmares. Cruel eyes, thin lips, the man she had killed in Prescott. "Arthur Calhoun's real name," Cole said quietly, "is Arthur Devereaux, Thomas Devereaux's younger brother." The room seemed to tilt. Margaret gripped the edge of the table. "He's been building his empire for 17 years, Cole continued. "Changed his name, went legitimate, became respectable. But he never forgot. My deputy in Tucson says Calhoun keeps a picture of his brother in his office. Says he looks at it every day. He knows who I am. Reed sure as hell does now. And Reed reports to Calhoun." Cole's expression was grim. "Maggie, this isn't just about water rights. This is personal. Calhoun doesn't just want your land. He wants revenge." Margaret thought of Iris locked in her bedroom, already pulling away, thought of the life she had built, the 10 years of peace, all of it crumbling like sand. What does he plan to do? Don't know yet. But Reed's the kind of man who gets paid to make problems disappear, and Calhoun has enough money to make sure those problems stay disappeared. Margaret looked at the wanted poster of Thomas Devereaux, remembered the day she had killed him, remembered the emptiness she had felt, the certainty that violence had solved nothing. "I can leave," she said. "Take Iris and go somewhere Calhoun can't find us." "Can you?" Cole asked. "Can you run for the rest of your life? Can you ask Iris to run with you?" Margaret had no answer. Cole stood to leave. At the door he paused. "Samuel Garrett was my partner Maggie, long time ago before you knew him. He wrote me letters, sometimes talked about you, said you were the strongest person he'd ever met, but that your strength came from caring too much, not too little." He pulled something from his pocket and set it on the table. A tarnished silver badge, 5-pointed star, the words U.S. Marshal, barely visible. "That was Samuel's. I never turned it in after he died. Technically, it's still active. If you're wearing this, you're acting under federal authority. What you do is legal." Margaret stared at the badge. Her husband's badge, the symbol of everything he had stood for. Justice, law, the opposite of everything the Iron Rose had been. "I can't," she whispered. "Can't or won't." Cole's voice was gentle. "You swore you'd never kill again. I respect that. But you also swore to protect your daughter. Which oath matters more?" After he left, Margaret sat holding Samuel's badge. Outside, the desert night was silent except for the distant cry of a coyote. Inside, her daughter slept behind a locked door, dreaming of a mother who no longer existed. Margaret made her decision. She went to the barn as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky. Under the 4th floorboard beneath the tin box Iris had removed was a second compartment. This one held items Margaret had sworn never to touch again. The gun belt was made of dark leather tooled with intricate patterns fitted perfectly to her waist and hips. The twin holsters were positioned for a cross-draw angled for maximum speed, and nestled in those holsters were the weapons that had made her legend. Custom Colt Peacemakers, .45 caliber, with ivory grips engraved with her initials. The barrels were inscribed with scrollwork that disguised their true purpose. They were works of art forged by a master gunsmith who understood that beauty and death were not opposites, but complements. Margaret lifted the guns. They felt heavier than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply grown weaker during 10 years of peace. She checked the mechanisms, found them still flawless despite the years. Muscle memory guided her hands through the familiar motions. Load, check, holster. In the growing light, she changed clothes. Off came the simple cotton dress, the practical apron, the widow's weeds. On went dark leather pants, a white shirt, a vest reinforced with hidden steel plates. The gun belt settled around her hips with a weight that was both familiar and foreign. She had kept her hair long out of habit, Samuel's preference. Now she gathered it back in a severe braid, functional rather than decorative. She looked at herself in the small mirror by the barn door and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not quite Margaret Sutton anymore. Not quite the Iron Rose. Something in between. Something new. She practiced the draw. Once, twice, 10 times. Her hands were slower than they had been at 25, but they were still fast. Faster than most. Fast enough. When she walked back to the house, the sun had risen fully, painting the desert gold. She found Iris in the kitchen, a carpetbag at her feet, her face set with determination. "I'm going to Aunt Judith's in Tucson," Iris said without preamble. "I need time to think, away from here, away from you." Margaret wanted to argue, to explain, to beg her to stay, but she had spent Iris's entire life making choices for her. This choice at least belonged to her daughter. "All right," was all she said. Iris blinked, clearly expecting resistance. "That's it. You're just going to let me go. You're 18 years old. You can make your own decisions." Iris's jaw tightened. She picked up her bag. "I'll send word when I get there." She made it to the door before Margaret spoke again. "Iris?" Her daughter turned, and for just a moment her defenses dropped. She looked young again, uncertain, the girl who had once thought her mother could protect her from anything. "I love you," Margaret said. "Whatever else you believe about me, whatever else turns out to be a lie, believe that. I have loved you every day of your life." Iris's eyes shimmered with tears she refused to shed. "I know," she whispered. Then she was gone, walking toward town, where the morning stage would carry her to Tucson and Aunt Judith, and time to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. Margaret stood on her porch and watched her daughter disappear down the road. She felt Samuel's badge heavy in her pocket, felt the weight of the Colts at her hips, felt the weight of 43 deaths and 10 years of peace and one terrible choice made in anger 17 years ago. Arthur Calhoun wanted revenge. He would use Iris to get it. Margaret knew this as certainly as she knew her own name, both the one she had been born with and the one she had chosen. The Iron Rose had been retired for 10 years, but retirement, it seemed, was over. Margaret Sutton went back inside and began to pack for a journey to Tucson. She moved efficiently, gathering supplies, checking ammunition, writing a brief letter to Sheriff Cole explaining where she had gone and why. She strapped on the gun belt openly, now no longer hiding what she was. Just after noon, she saddled her horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding that had served her well. She mounted up and turned toward Tucson, following the same road Iris had taken that morning, the road that would lead her back to violence, back to blood, back to everything she had tried to leave behind. But this time, she told herself, it would be different. This time she fought not for revenge, but for protection. Not for herself, but for her daughter. Samuel's badge rested over her heart. His memory rode with her. The desert stretched endless in all directions, beautiful and merciless, exactly like the life she had lived, exactly like the choice she had made. Behind her, Copper Ridge faded into the distance. Ahead, somewhere on the road to Tucson, her daughter traveled unaware of the danger closing in. And beyond that, in the city itself, Arthur Devereaux waited with 17 years of patience and hate. Margaret Rose Thornton, the woman who had been the Iron Rose, rode toward whatever reckoning awaited her. She did not know if she would survive, did not know if Iris would ever forgive her, did not know if Samuel's ghost would approve or condemn. She knew only this: her daughter was in danger, and she would ride through hell itself to bring her home safe. The sun climbed higher. The desert shimmered with heat. And the Iron Rose, pulled from retirement by blood and love and necessity, rode on into a future as uncertain as the shifting sands beneath her horse's hooves. The road to Tucson stretched like a scar across the face of the Arizona desert, 2 days of hard riding through country that could kill the unwary. Margaret pushed her buckskin gelding at a steady pace, not reckless, but determined, covering ground with the efficiency of someone who had spent years learning to read the land and respect its dangers. The November sun beat down without mercy, and dust devils danced in the distance like spirits of the restless dead. She had left Copper Ridge 8 hours after Iris, which meant her daughter had at least a half-day's lead. The morning stage would have gotten Iris to Tucson by nightfall, depositing her safely at Aunt Judith's house in the respectable eastern quarter of the city. Safe. Margaret clung to that word like a prayer, though part of her, the part that had been the Iron Rose, knew that safety was an illusion. Arthur Calhoun had money men and 17 years of hate. If he wanted Iris, he would take her, unless Margaret got there first. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood, Margaret guided her horse off the main road. 5 miles north, hidden in a box canyon that most travelers never noticed, lay the remains of Crimson Gulch. Once a prosperous mining camp, it had died when the silver played out, leaving behind a collection of weathered buildings and the stubborn few who refused to abandon what they had built. Among those stubborn few was Dutch Morrison. Margaret had not seen Dutch in 12 years, not since the day she had ridden away from her old life. But some debts ran deeper than time, and the debt between Dutch Morrison and Samuel Garrett was one of those. If Dutch still lived, if he still remembered, he would help her. He had to. The town appeared as she rounded a bend in the canyon, a dozen buildings clinging to existence like lichen on stone. Smoke rose from a single chimney. A few chickens scratched in the dirt. A mule brayed from somewhere out of sight. It looked abandoned, but Margaret knew better. Dutch had always preferred places other people overlooked. She found him behind the old assay office, splitting wood with methodical precision. He was older than she remembered, his hair gone completely white, his face mapped with wrinkles carved by sun and time. But his shoulders were still broad, his movements still economical and sure. When he heard her horse, he turned slowly, the axe held loosely in one hand. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then Dutch set down the axe and wiped his hands on his pants. "Rose Thornton," his voice carried the weight of years. "Heard you were dead." "I was." Margaret dismounted in one fluid motion. "For 10 years I was Margaret Sutton, quiet widow, respectable woman." Dutch's dark eyes, still sharp despite his age, took in the gun belt, the worn leather, the tense set of her shoulders. "And now they took my daughter." The words came out flat, emotionless, but her white-knuckled grip on the reins betrayed her. Understanding flickered across his weathered face. He gestured toward his cabin, a small structure with a good roof and solid walls. "Come inside. Tell me." The interior of Dutch's home was sparse but clean. A stove, a table, a narrow bed, shelves lined with books. Margaret noticed titles on surveying, mineralogy, military tactics. Dutch had been an Army scout during the war, had ridden with Samuel Garrett through some of the bloodiest campaigns. After the war ended, he had drifted west like so many others, looking for a place where the past might lose its grip. They sat at the table. Dutch poured coffee from a pot that had been kept warm on the stove. The liquid was thick and black and strong enough to strip paint. Margaret told him everything, about Iris going to Tucson, about Arthur Calhoun, who had been Arthur Devereaux, about Dalton Reed and the confrontation on Copper Ridge's main street, about the Iron Rose dragged from retirement by necessity and fear. Dutch listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as though reading prophecy in its depths. "Arthur Devereaux," he said finally. "I remember him, younger brother. Thomas kept him out of the worst of the gang's business, tried to keep him clean. Kid was smart, educated. Thomas used to say Arthur was going to be something better than an outlaw. He became a railroad baron instead. Same thing, just legal." Dutch looked up, met her eyes. "You killed his brother Rose. Man's got a right to hate you for that. I know. But he's going after your daughter to get to you. That crosses a line." "I need eyes on Fort Defiance." Margaret's tone brooked no argument. "Where they're keeping her, how many men, what defenses." Dutch stood and moved to a trunk in the corner. He opened it and pulled out a rolled map, spreading it across the table. Fort Defiance, marked in faded ink, sat 30 miles north of Tucson, an old cavalry post abandoned after the Apache Wars, perfect for someone who wanted privacy and security. "I scouted that fort back in '63, Dutch said, tracing lines on the map with one weathered finger. "Stone walls 8 feet high. Main gate faces south. Officers' quarters on the east side. Stables and supply buildings on the west. There's an old mine tunnel on the north side, dug by soldiers looking for silver. Comes up in the well house about 20 yards from the officers' quarters." Margaret studied the map, her mind already calculating angles and possibilities. If Iris is there, that's where they'd keep her. The officer's quarters. Secure, visible from the walls, easy to guard. You planning to walk through the front gate? I'm planning to give Calhoun exactly what he wants, me. While I keep his attention, you slip in through that tunnel and get Iris out. Dutch was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he shook his head slowly. You're talking about facing how many guns? 20, 30, however many it takes. Rose, you're 42 years old. I watched you practice your drawback when you were 25. You were faster than chain lightning then. But that was 17 years ago. Reflexes slow, eyes get weaker, hands shake. The words stung because they were true. Margaret had felt it during her practice that morning, the fractional delay between thought and action, the muscle memory fighting against time's erosion. She was still fast, probably faster than most men, but she was no longer the Iron Rose of legend. I know, she said quietly. They sat in silence as the light outside faded and the temperature began to drop. Dutch relit the stove, adding wood with practiced efficiency. He made a simple meal of beans and cornbread, and they ate without speaking, two old soldiers preparing for a battle that only one of them might survive. After the dishes were cleared, Dutch pulled out a second chair and sat across from Margaret. The cabin's single lamp cast long shadows across his face. Samuel saved my life at Shiloh, he said, his voice soft in the gathering darkness. I was pinned down, wounded rebels closing in. Samuel came back for me. Took a bullet in the shoulder doing it, but he got me out. I owed him everything. Margaret knew this story. Samuel had told her once late at night when the nightmares from the war made sleep impossible. He had never called it bravery, just something that needed doing. When he died, Dutch continued, I wanted to ride with you. Wanted to help you hunt the Devereaux gang. But you disappeared so fast I never got the chance. I didn't want help. I wanted blood. And now, Margaret looked at her hands, calloused from ranch work, scarred from years of living. Now I want my daughter safe. Blood doesn't matter anymore. Justice doesn't matter. Just her. Dutch nodded slowly. That's the difference between the Rose I remember and the woman sitting here now. That Rose fought for pride and anger. You're fighting for love. Makes you more dangerous, not less. He stood and retrieved his gun belt from a peg by the door. A single Remington revolver in a worn holster, nothing fancy but well-maintained and ready. I'll ride with you, not for revenge, not for glory, for Samuel's memory, and because your daughter deserves a chance to know her mother flaws and all. They left Crimson Gulch before dawn, two riders moving through darkness toward Tucson. Dutch knew trails that avoided the main road paths that would bring them to Fort Defiance from the north unseen. They rode in silence, saving breath for the journey, each lost in their own thoughts. Meanwhile, in Tucson, Iris Sutton had arrived at Aunt Judith's house as the evening shadows lengthened. Judith Mercer was Margaret's sister-in-law, Samuel's younger sister, a kind woman who had married a merchant and lived a comfortable, quiet life. She welcomed Iris with open arms and concerned questions that Iris deflected with vague explanations about needing time away from the ranch. That night, unable to sleep, Iris had climbed to Judith's attic, searching through old trunks for something, anything that might help her understand who her mother really was. She found photographs of Samuel letters he had written home during the war, and finally tucked in a hatbox a letter addressed to Margaret in Samuel's careful handwriting. Iris had read it 3 times, tears streaming down her face, trying to reconcile the gentle words with the woman who had killed 43 men. Her father had loved the Iron Rose, had seen something in her worth saving, had believed she could change. And she had changed, hadn't she? For 18 years, Margaret had been exactly what a mother should be: patient, kind, protective. It was only now, seeing the guns and the newspaper clippings, that Iris questioned everything. She was still holding the letter when she heard hoofbeats outside. Not the gentle clip-clop of a single horse, but the thunder of multiple riders approaching fast. Iris moved to the window and looked down to see 6 men dismounting in front of Judith's house. In the moonlight, she recognized Dalton Reed's scarred face. Fear flooded through her, sharp and cold. She ran downstairs to find Judith already at the door, her face pale. "Don't open it," Iris whispered urgently, but it was too late. The door burst inward, the lock splintering under a single kick. Reed stepped through, followed by 3 of his men. They moved with the casual confidence of men who knew they would not be opposed. "Mrs. Mercer," Reed said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of mock courtesy, "we're here for the girl. Make this easy on yourself." Judith moved to block the stairs, her hands trembling, but her chin lifted in defiance. "You have no right. This is my home. I'll call the law." Reed's smile had no warmth. "Ma'am, we are the law. Mr. Calhoun owns the sheriff in this town. Now step aside." Iris appeared at the top of the stairs, a fireplace poker gripped in both hands. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all she had. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "You want me? You'll have to come through me first." Reed looked up at her, and something like respect flickered in his cold eyes. "You got your mama's spirit, girl. I'll give you that. But spirit don't stop bullets. Drop the poker and come quiet. Nobody needs to get hurt." "My mother will hunt you," Iris said. "You called her the Iron Rose. You know what she can do." "I'm counting on it." Reed's voice was soft, almost gentle. "See, Mr. Calhoun don't want you dead, Miss Sutton. He wants your mama to come for you. And when she does, when she rides into his trap trying to save you, that's when he'll settle accounts." He nodded to his men. Two of them rushed up the stairs. Iris swung the poker connected with one man's shoulder with a satisfying crack, but the other grabbed her arms and wrestled the weapon away. She fought kicking and scratching, but they were stronger. They bound her wrists with rough rope and gagged her with a bandana. Reed looked at Judith, who had collapsed into a chair, sobbing. "Tell the Iron Rose we'll be at Fort Defiance. 3 days. She comes alone or the girl dies. You understand?" Judith could only nod, tears streaming down her face. They carried Iris out into the night and lifted her onto a horse. She was tied to the saddle, helpless, as the riders turned north and spurred their mounts into a gallop. Tucson disappeared behind them, and ahead, somewhere in the darkness, Fort Defiance waited. Iris had never been so frightened in her life. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. Anger. Not at her captors, though she hated them, at herself. For running away. For leaving her mother alone. For believing, even for a moment, that the past could be escaped by simply turning your back on it. Her mother had spent 10 years trying to protect her from this world, this violence, and Iris had repaid that protection by judging her, by recoiling in horror at the very strength that might now be the only thing that could save her. If she survived this, if her mother came for her, if they both somehow made it through what was coming, Iris swore she would never question that strength again. She would try to understand it instead. The riders reached Fort Defiance as dawn broke over the desert. The old cavalry post loomed against the lightning sky, stone walls, and wooden buildings weathered by decades of sun and wind. Arthur Calhoun's men had been busy. New gates had been installed, reinforced with iron. Sentries walked the walls. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys. This was no abandoned ruin. This was a fortress. They took Iris to the officers' quarters, a stone building with barred windows and a heavy door. Inside, someone had made efforts at comfort. A bed with clean linens, a washstand, chair, and small table. It looked almost like a guest room except for the bars and the guard stationed outside. Dalton Reed removed Iris's gag, but left her wrists bound. "Mister, Calhoun will want to speak with you," he said. "Meantime, you got food, water, a bed. Could be worse." "Could be free?" Iris shot back. Reed's scarred face creased into something that might have been a smile. "Your mama taught you defiance. That's good. You'll need it." He left, locking the door behind him. Iris sat on the bed and tried to calm her racing heart. She was trapped. Bait in a trap designed to kill her mother. And there was nothing she could do about it except wait and pray that Margaret Sutton, the woman who had been the Iron Rose, was as formidable as the legends claimed. An hour later, the door opened again. This time the man who entered was different from the rough outlaws who had brought her here. He was perhaps 58, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead. He wore a tailored suit, expensive boots, a gold watch chain across his vest. His face was handsome in a severe way, marked by intelligence and an absolute certainty in his own righteousness. Arthur Calhoun looked like a senator or a banker, not an outlaw's brother seeking revenge. He pulled up the chair and sat down, studying Iris with dark eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of her own, not in color but in the intensity of their gaze. "Miss Sutton," he said, his voice cultured and gentle. "I apologize for the rough treatment. This was not how I wished to make your acquaintance." Iris said nothing. She had learned from watching her mother that silence could be its own kind of power. Calhoun continued unperturbed. "You're not the target of my anger. I want you to understand that. This is between your mother and me. You are simply the means to an end." "The means?" Iris found her voice sharp with anger. "I'm a person, not a chess piece." "Of course you are, which is why I'm going to explain something to you. I'm going to tell you the truth about your mother, about my brother, about the day everything changed. And then you can judge for yourself who the villain really is." He settled back in his chair, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of old grief carefully preserved through 17 years of remembering. "My brother raised me after our parents died. I was 8. Thomas was barely 18 himself, but he kept us together." Calhoun's eyes grew distant. The war changed him, made him hard. When he came back, there was no work, no future. The gang was desperation, not evil. "He became an outlaw," Iris said. "He became desperate. The South was destroyed. There was no work, no future. The Devereaux gang, yes, they robbed and killed. But Thomas made sure I was never part of it. He sent me east to school, paid for my education with blood money I didn't know was blood money. He wanted me to be better than him, to have the life he never could." Calhoun leaned forward, his intensity making Iris press back against the wall. "And then your mother killed him, in Prescott, May of 1868. She challenged him to a duel, and she shot him dead in the street." "He killed my father first," Iris said, though her voice shook. "Did he—" Calhoun's voice was soft, deadly. "I have witnesses, Miss Sutton. Passengers from that train. Your father was trying to evacuate civilians when shooting started. It was chaos. Bullets flying from everywhere. The Marshal Service said it was the Devereaux gang that killed Samuel Garrett. But here's what they didn't say in the official report." He pulled a folded paper from his inside pocket and passed it to Iris. Her bound hands made it difficult, but she managed to unfold it. It was a statement dated June 1860, signed by 3 passengers. The words blurred as she read them. Confusion in the firefight, multiple shooters. Impossible to say with certainty who fired the fatal shots. The Devereaux gang present, yes, but also bounty hunters, rival gangs, opportunistic thieves. Samuel Garrett had died in crossfire, and in the chaos and grief that followed, everyone had blamed Thomas Devereaux because he was the most notorious outlaw present. "Your mother hunted my brother for 2 years, Calhoun said, taking back the paper. She tracked down every member of his gang and killed them one by one. And when she finally cornered Thomas in Prescott, he tried to surrender." Iris's breath caught. "That's not true." "There were witnesses to that, too. Thomas threw down his gun, raised his hands, said he was done running, and your mother shot him anyway. 2 bullets through the heart, murdered an unarmed man in cold blood." The room spun. Iris wanted to call him a liar, wanted to defend her mother, but the certainty in Calhoun's voice planted seeds of doubt that grew like poison. "My brother died in the dirt," Calhoun continued, his voice tight with old pain. "And I swore I would make things right. Not through violence, I'm not an outlaw, but through success. I built an empire in Thomas's name, became the man he wanted me to be. And I waited for the day when I could face the Iron Rose and show her that Thomas Devereaux mattered, that his life had value, that she didn't have the right to decide who lived and who died." He stood looking down at Iris with something that might have been pity. "Your mother is a killer, Miss Sutton. Oh, she wore a badge and worked for Wells Fargo. But what's the difference between her and Thomas? Both took lives. Both justified it with their own sense of right and wrong. The only difference is history calls one a hero and one a villain." He moved toward the door, then paused. "She'll come for you. I know she will. And when she does, I want you to watch. I want you to see what she really is. A woman who solves everything with violence. And then you can decide whether she deserves your love or your judgment." The door closed behind him, the lock clicking into place. Iris sat alone in the barred room, Calhoun's words echoing in her mind. She thought about her mother, about the newspaper clippings, about 43 dead men, about the legend of the Iron Rose fastest gun in the territory who never showed mercy. Had her mother murdered Thomas Devereaux in cold blood? Had Samuel Garrett's death been a tragic accident, blamed on the wrong man? Had everything Iris believed been a lie, built on another lie she didn't know, and that uncertainty was worse than any prison. Miles away, Margaret and Dutch approached Fort Defiance from the north, moving through the pre-dawn darkness with the silence of experienced hunters. They left their horses a mile back, hidden in a ravine, and covered the final distance on foot. Dutch moved like a ghost despite his age, and Margaret matched him, step for step, her hand resting on the butt of her right hand, Colt. They reached a ridge overlooking the fort just as the sun broke the horizon. Margaret pulled out a small telescope, a relic from her Wells Fargo days, and surveyed the scene below. Dutch had been right. At least 20 men, maybe more. 6 on the walls, rotating in shifts. Others moving between buildings, checking horses, preparing for the day. This was no ragtag outlaw camp. This was a professional operation, well-funded and well-organized. "Officers' quarters, east side," Dutch murmured beside her. "See the bars on the windows." Margaret adjusted the telescope and found them. New iron bars, freshly installed. Someone was being kept there. It had to be Iris. "I count 23 men," Dutch said, "all armed. Calhoun's in the center building, the old commander's office. Reed is his second, organizing the watch." Margaret lowered the telescope. Her hands were steady, her breathing calm, but inside her mind raced through possibilities and discarded them one after another. A frontal assault was suicide. Even if she was the Iron Rose of legend, she couldn't outdraw 23 guns. But she didn't need to outdraw them all. She just needed to create enough chaos for Dutch to slip in through that northern tunnel and get Iris out. "Tonight," she said, "after dark, I'll approach from the south through the main gate. When I've got their attention, you go in through the tunnel." Dutch looked at her for a long moment. "Rose, even if you're faster than you've ever been, you can't beat those odds. This is a death sentence." "Maybe. But Iris lives, that's all that matters." They withdrew from the ridge and found shelter in a cluster of boulders where they could rest and wait for nightfall. The desert day passed slowly, the sun climbing to its zenith and then beginning its descent. They shared water and jerky in silence, 2 old warriors preparing for a battle that felt inevitable as gravity. As the sun touched the western horizon, Dutch spoke quietly. "Tell me about her, your daughter." Margaret was surprised by the question. She thought for a moment, then began to speak, her voice soft with memory and love. "She's brilliant. Taught herself to read before I could teach her, always asking questions, always wanting to know how things work, why things are the way they are. She wants to be a doctor, dreams of going to medical school back east. Takes after her father, then. Samuel was always the one asking questions, too." "Yes." Margaret smiled despite everything. "She has his eyes, his kindness, his belief that the world can be better than it is." Her smile faded. "And now she knows what I am, what I did. I saw the way she looked at me, Dutch, like I was a stranger, like I was a monster. You're her mother. That counts for something." "Does it?" "When the mother is a killer, when every good thing she did was built on a foundation of lies." Dutch was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Samuel used to say that people aren't defined by their worst moment. They're defined by what they do after, by whether they grow or whether they let that worst moment consume them. I tried to grow. I tried to be better. And you were. For 10 years you were. The woman I remember, the Iron Rose, she would have ridden straight into that fort, guns blazing, not caring who died as long as she got what she wanted. But you're not her anymore. You're planning. You're thinking. You're willing to die so your daughter can live." He met her eyes. "That's not a monster, Rose. That's a mother." The words settled over Margaret like a benediction. She wanted to believe them, wanted to believe that 10 years of quiet goodness could somehow balance the scales against 43 deaths. But she wasn't sure the universe kept such careful accounts. Darkness fell over the desert like a curtain. Stars emerged brilliant and cold. Margaret checked her Colts for the 20th time, ensuring each chamber was loaded, each mechanism smooth. Dutch checked his Remington and the knife at his belt. They didn't speak of what might go wrong, all the ways this plan could fail. Words wouldn't change the odds. When the moon rose full and bright, they moved. Dutch circled wide to the north, making for the hidden mine entrance. Margaret walked straight toward the fort's southern gate, making no effort at stealth. She wanted to be seen, wanted every eye on her. 100 yards from the gate, a shout went up from the walls. "Rider approaching!" Margaret stopped and stood perfectly still, hands hanging loose at her sides, within easy reach of her guns. Light bloomed from the walls as sentries lit torches. She could hear voices urgent and confused. Then a new voice cut through the confusion, calm and authoritative. Let her approach. Arthur Calhoun had been waiting for this moment. The gates swung open with a groan of iron hinges. Margaret walked forward slowly, counting her steps, measuring distances. 20 yards, 15, 10. She crossed the threshold into Fort Defiance and stopped in the center of the courtyard. Men emerged from buildings, from shadows surrounding her. She counted them without moving her head. 24 now, one more than Dutch had tallied, all armed, all watching her with a mixture of fear and fascination. Arthur Calhoun descended from the rampart stairs, moving with unhurried grace. In the torchlight, his silver hair gleamed. His face was calm, almost serene, the face of a man who had spent 17 years preparing for this exact moment. He stopped 20 paces away, and Margaret got her first clear look at Thomas Devereaux's brother. She saw echoes of the man she had killed, the same high forehead, the same dark eyes. But where Thomas had been hard and cruel, Arthur was refined, controlled. "Margaret Rose Thornton," he said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet courtyard. "The Iron Rose herself. I expected someone taller." "Arthur Devereaux," Margaret replied. "I expected someone with more spine than to hide behind a girl." A flash of anger crossed Calhoun's face, quickly controlled. "Your daughter is safe. I'm not a barbarian. But we have accounts to settle, you and I. Your brother was an outlaw and a killer. I was doing my job." "Your job?" Calhoun's voice hardened. "Is that what you call murder? Thomas was unarmed when you shot him. Witnesses saw it. He threw down his gun and you killed him anyway." Margaret felt the words hit like physical blows. She had spent 17 years trying not to think about that moment in Prescott, the split second when Thomas Devereaux had hesitated, when his hand had moved toward his gun but never quite reached it. She had told herself it was a fair fight, had to be a fair fight. Because if it wasn't, then everything she had become was built on murder. "He reached for his weapon," she said, but even to her own ears the words sounded hollow. "Liar." Calhoun took a step forward. "You wanted him dead. Didn't matter if he surrendered. Didn't matter if he was the one who actually killed your husband. You needed someone to blame, someone to punish, and Thomas was convenient." "Where is my daughter?" Calhoun gestured toward the officers' quarters. The door opened, and Dalton Reed emerged, pulling Iris behind him. The girl's hands were bound, but she was unharmed. When she saw Margaret, her eyes widened. "Ma," she whispered. Margaret's careful control cracked. Just for a moment, just long enough for Calhoun to see it. To see that this legendary gunfighter, this woman who had killed 43 men without hesitation, could still be hurt, could still bleed. "Here's my offer," Calhoun said. "You and me, one-on-one. Old-fashioned duel. You win, you and your daughter go free. I give you my word, and despite what you think of my family, I keep my word. I win well." He smiled without warmth. "I expect the outcome will be obvious." Margaret looked at Iris, tried to communicate through her eyes what she could not say aloud. That help was coming, that she should be ready to run, that everything would be all right. But Iris's face held something Margaret had not expected to see. Not fear, not hope, doubt. The girl was looking at her mother and wondering if Arthur Calhoun was right, if the Iron Rose was just a murderer with better PR. That doubt hurt worse than any bullet. "Before I agree," Margaret said, turning back to Calhoun, "I want to say goodbye to my daughter. 30 seconds, that's all." Calhoun considered, then nodded magnanimously. He was that certain of his victory. "You have 30 seconds. Margaret walked toward Iris, each step measured and deliberate. Reed stepped back, allowing mother and daughter to face each other. Margaret knelt, bringing herself to Iris's eye level. "I'm sorry," she whispered, low enough that only Iris could hear. "Sorry for the lies. Sorry for everything." Iris's eyes filled with tears. "Did you murder him, Thomas Devereaux? Did you kill an unarmed man?" The question hung between them, sharp as a blade. Margaret could lie, could give her daughter the comfort of a hero's story. But she had promised no more lies. "I don't know," she said quietly. "It happened so fast. I thought he was drawing, but maybe I just wanted him to be. Maybe I needed him to be guilty so I could live with what I'd become." A tear ran down Iris's cheek. "What are you? Your mother, flawed and broken and trying. That's all I've ever been." "Time's up," Calhoun called. Margaret stood. She looked at Iris one more time, trying to memorize her daughter's face in case this was the last time she would see it. Then she turned and walked back to face Arthur Calhoun in the center of the courtyard. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the walls, Dutch Morrison crept through the old mine tunnel, moving toward the well house and the officers' quarters beyond. Somewhere above, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the drama below. And in the courtyard of Fort Defiance, two people who had never met, but whose lives had been bound together by violence and grief, prepared to settle their accounts in the oldest way humanity knew, with blood. The courtyard of Fort Defiance lay silent except for the whisper of wind through the stone walls and the nervous shuffle of horses in the stable. Torches flickered, casting dancing shadows that made the assembled men look like spirits, insubstantial and unreal. Margaret stood 40 paces from Arthur Calhoun, her hands loose at her sides, every muscle in her body coiled tight as a spring, ready to release. This was the moment she had spent 10 years running from. Not the violence itself, she had always known violence might find her again, but the reckoning. The moment when she would have to face what she had done, what she had been in front of the person whose judgment mattered most. Iris watched from near the officer's quarters, Reed's hand still on her shoulder. Margaret could feel her daughter's eyes like a physical weight, could feel the question hanging unspoken between them. Who are you really? The gentle mother who baked bread and taught children to read, or the Iron Rose who killed without hesitation and never looked back? Maybe Margaret thought she was both. Maybe that was the terrible truth she had never wanted her daughter to learn, that people were not one thing or another, hero or villain, but a complicated mixture of choices and consequences and the stories they told themselves to make sleep possible. Calhoun rolled his shoulders, loosening them. He wore a gun belt now, the leather dark and well-oiled, the holster positioned low on his right hip. Professional rig, fast draw setup. He had practiced for this moment, Margaret realized. 17 years of practice every day, preparing to face the woman who had killed his brother. Standard rules, Calhoun called out, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard. Dalton Reed will count to 3. On 3 we draw. First shot wins. Fair and square, witnessed by everyone here. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Her mouth was dry. Her heart hammered against her ribs, though her breathing remained steady. She had been in dozens of duels, maybe hundreds of quick-draw situations over the 6 years she had worn the Iron Rose name. But she had never fought with so much to lose. Reed stepped forward, positioning himself equidistant from both combatants. His scarred face was unreadable in the torchlight. "Ready?" Calhoun's hand hovered near his gun. Margaret mirrored his stance, her right hand steady as stone despite the fear singing through her veins. "1," Reed called. Margaret's vision narrowed. The world contracted to a tunnel. At the far end of that tunnel, Arthur Calhoun stood, a man carrying 17 years of grief and rage. Behind him, in shadow, 3 figures appeared on the roof of the barracks building, riflemen, moving into position with practiced silence. Margaret's calculation shifted instantly. This was not a fair duel. This was an execution dressed up as justice. 2, Reed continued. The riflemen settled into firing positions. Margaret could see the moonlight glinting off their rifle barrels, all 3 aimed directly at her. The moment she drew, the moment Calhoun gave the signal, those rifles would fire. She could not outdraw 3 simultaneously fired bullets. No one could. But she could not stop now, could not back down. Because Dutch was counting on her distraction to reach Iris. Because her daughter needed to see that her mother, whatever her flaws, did not run when running, would be easier. The M.A. "Behind you!" Iris's scream cut through the count like a knife. Margaret spun her body, moving on pure instinct, before conscious thought could slow her down. She saw the riflemen clearly, now saw their fingers tightening on triggers, saw the trap closing. Calhoun's hand dropped to his gun, the movement smooth and practiced. And Margaret made a choice. Instead of drawing on Calhoun, instead of trying for the impossible shot at the man 20 paces away, while 3 rifles targeted her back, she drew both Colts and spun a full circle. Her body became a blur of motion muscle memory from 1,000 practice draws taking over. The left-hand Colt came up first, angled high. 3 shots fired so fast they sounded almost like one continuous roar. The first rifleman jerked backward, Margaret's bullet taking him in the chest. The second twisted and felt his rifle clattering down the barracks roof. The third managed to fire, but Margaret was already moving her body, dropping into a crouch, and the bullet passed through empty air where her head had been a heartbeat before. Her right-hand Colt was already tracking. 2 more shots, impossibly fast, taking down the 2 men who had been flanking Calhoun, hidden in the shadows near the stable. They fell without a sound, their guns never clearing leather. 6 shots. 5 targets, all down in the space of 3 heartbeats. But the 6th shot, that final round in her right hand, Colt Margaret did not fire at Arthur Calhoun. Instead, she pivoted and aimed at the chain holding Iris's bound wrists to the iron ring on the officers' quarters wall. A 15-yard shot in torchlight at a moving target no bigger than a silver dollar. The Colt roared. The chain severed. Iris stumbled forward, hands free, directly into Dalton Reed. And then Margaret's guns were empty. Click, click, nothing left. Time seemed to slow. Calhoun had his weapon drawn now, the pistol aimed directly at Margaret's chest. She stood defenseless, both Colts empty, no time to reload. She had gambled everything on those 6 impossible shots, and now the price was due. Calhoun's finger tightened on the trigger. Another shot rang out, but not from Calhoun's gun. Calhoun staggered, his weapon dropping from suddenly nerveless fingers. Blood bloomed on his shoulder, a dark stain spreading across his expensive white shirt. He looked down at the wound, then up, searching for the shooter. Iris stood with Dalton Reed's pistol in her shaking hands, smoke still curling from the barrel. Reed himself looked stunned, his hand reaching for his empty holster, realizing too late that the girl had stolen his weapon in the confusion. "Don't move," Iris said, her voice trembling but determined. She kept the pistol trained on Calhoun, though her hands shook so badly Margaret feared she might drop it. "Don't any of you move." For a frozen moment, no one did. 20 men, all armed, all staring at the 18-year-old girl who had just shot their employer. Staring at the iron rows, standing with empty guns and a daughter who had just killed to save her. Then the thunder of hooves shattered the tableau. Dutch Morrison burst from the well house, shotgun in hand, both barrels aimed at the nearest cluster of men. "Federal marshal business," he roared, his voice carrying the authority of his old army days. "Any man who moves dies where he stands." Behind him, emerging from the darkness beyond the fort walls, came more riders. Sheriff Owen Cole leading a posse of 6 men, all with weapons drawn. They must have followed Margaret, and Dutch staying back, but ready to intervene if needed. Cole rode through the open gate and surveyed the scene with a lawman's practiced eye. 5 men down on the roof and near the stable. Calhoun wounded. Iris, holding a gun on her mother's, would-be killer. He let out a long breath. "Arthur Calhoun," Cole said, formally, "also known as Arthur Devereaux, you're under arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, and whatever other charges I can think of on the ride back to Tucson." The fight went out of the assembled men. Without Calhoun's money and authority, they were just hired guns, and hired guns knew when to fold. One by one, they raised their hands. Reed, after a long look at Iris, did the same. Margaret's legs nearly gave out. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the impossible shots was draining away, leaving her hollow and shaking. She managed to holster her empty Colts with hands that trembled only slightly, then looked at her daughter. Iris still held Reed's pistol, but she was staring at it now as though it were a snake she had just realized was poisonous. Her face had gone pale, her breathing rapid and shallow. Margaret crossed the distance between them in 3 quick strides. Gently, carefully, she took the gun from Iris's unresisting fingers and handed it to Dutch. "You did what you had to," Margaret said softly. "That's different from what I did." Iris looked up at her mother, tears streaming down her face. "I shot him. I pulled the trigger. You saved my life." Margaret wanted to pull her daughter into her arms, but held back, uncertain if the embrace would be welcome. You saw danger and you acted. That's not murder, sweetheart. That's survival." Iris's composure shattered. She collapsed against Margaret's chest, sobbing, and this time Margaret did not hesitate. She wrapped her arms around her daughter and held her tight, one hand stroking Iris's dark curls while the other pressed her close. Around them, Cole's men were binding Calhoun's wound and securing the prisoners. Dutch stood guard, his weathered face impassive, but his eyes revealing a deep satisfaction. The trap had been sprung, the impossible shots had landed, and against all odds, everyone who mattered had survived. Almost everyone. Margaret looked toward the barracks roof where 3 bodies lay, looked at the 2 men near the stable. 5 dead in as many seconds, all by her hand. 48 now, her count. 48 men who would never see another sunrise because Margaret Rose Thornton had been faster. The weight of it settled on her shoulders like stones. 10 years of peace ended. 10 years of pretending she was someone else shattered. And all of it witnessed by the daughter who would now carry her own burden, her own memory of pulling a trigger and watching a man fall. Sheriff Cole approached his expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Sutton, or should I say Mrs. Thornton, or just Rose?" "Margaret is fine," she said quietly, still holding Iris. "Just Margaret." "Well, Margaret, I'm going to need statements from everyone. But first, I need to know. Those men on the roof, you had a choice. Could have tried for Calhoun first, left them for later. Why did you go for them?" Margaret met his eyes steadily. "Because they were going to shoot me in the back. And if I died, my daughter would have been alone with 20 armed men and no hope of rescue. So yes, I killed them. And I'd do it again." Cole nodded slowly. "Self-defense, clear cut. Still going to be paperwork, but—" He shrugged. "Probably best you had witnesses." They brought Calhoun forward, his shoulder bandaged, his hands bound. His silver hair was disheveled, his expensive suit stained with blood and dirt. But his eyes still burned with that absolute certainty, that conviction of righteousness. He looked at Margaret, then at Iris. "It doesn't change anything," he said, his voice tight with pain. "You're still a killer. Your daughter knows it now. She'll always know. Every time she looks at you, she'll see those guns and remember what you are." Margaret felt Iris stiffen in her arms, felt her daughter pulling back to look Calhoun in the face. "You're wrong," Iris said, her voice steadier now. "When I look at my mother, I see a woman who spent 10 years being kind and gentle and good, who taught me to read and cook and think for myself, who built a life out of nothing because she wanted something better for me." She stepped fully away from Margaret, standing on her own feet, facing Calhoun directly. "I also see a woman who killed 5 men tonight to protect me, who walked into a trap knowing she might die, who chose to free me instead of killing you, even though killing you would have been easier." Tears still streaked her face, but her voice carried strength. "She's both, the killer and the mother, the Iron Rose and Margaret Sutton. And yes, that's complicated and messy, and sometimes it scares me. But she's still my mother, and I'm still her daughter. That doesn't change." Calhoun's face twisted with something that might have been pain, or might have been grief, or might have been the terrible realization that his 17 years of waiting had been for nothing. That revenge, when it finally came, brought no satisfaction, no closure, no peace. "My brother," he whispered. "Thomas, he was everything to me." Margaret stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried a gentleness that surprised even her. "I know, and I'm sorry, not for everything. Not for all of it, but for—" She paused, searching for truth in the tangle of memory and guilt. "I don't know if Thomas was drawing when I shot him. I was so angry, so full of grief and hate, that I might have seen what I wanted to see, might have killed a man who was trying to surrender." She looked down at her hands, the hands that had pulled those triggers. "I've spent 17 years not thinking about that moment, not asking that question. Because if the answer was yes, if I murdered your brother, then I couldn't be Margaret Sutton, couldn't be a good mother, couldn't be anything except the Iron Rose, and she was a monster I desperately wanted to leave behind." Calhoun stared at her, and some of the certainty drained from his face, replaced by something more complicated. "You admit it, then, that you might have murdered him?" "I admit I don't know. I thought I was right. I needed to be right. But probably I was just lost in my own anger and pain, and I let that pain turn me into exactly what I feared most. Someone who killed not because it was necessary, but because it was easier than living with grief. The confession hung in the air between them. Not an excuse, not a justification, just raw, terrible honesty. "Will it help?" Margaret asked quietly. "If I say I'm sorry, if I admit I might have been wrong, will it bring Thomas back? Will it undo 17 years?" Calhoun's face crumpled. For just a moment, the powerful railroad baron vanished, replaced by a boy who had lost his brother and spent a lifetime trying to make that loss mean something. "No," he whispered. "Nothing brings them back." Cole gestured to his deputies, who led Calhoun away toward the horses. The other prisoners were already mounted, hands bound, ready for the long ride to Tucson and trial. Reed went quietly, but as he passed Margaret, he paused. "Those 6 shots," he said, something like awe in his voice. "I've never seen anything like it. The stories don't do you justice, Rose." "Don't," Margaret said sharply. "Don't make it into something glorious. I killed 5 men tonight. That's not glory, that's just tragedy wearing a different face." Reed nodded slowly, then moved on. As the prisoners departed, the fort emptied. Cole's posse followed, escorting the bound men. Dutch approached Margaret and Iris, his shotgun finally lowered. "You two need time," he said simply. "I'll ride with the sheriff, make sure they all get to Tucson proper. You take your horses, take the long way home. Talk, listen, figure out what comes next." Margaret clasped his hand. "Thank you, Dutch, for everything. Samuel would be proud." "Samuel is proud," Dutch replied. "Wherever he is, he's watching, and he's proud of both of you." He tipped his hat to Iris. "You've got your father's courage, girl, and your mother's strength. That's a powerful combination." Then he too was gone, riding into the night, leaving mother and daughter alone in the empty fort. They stood in silence for a long moment. Around them, torches guttered and died. The moon, riding high now, cast everything in silver and shadow. Somewhere an owl called a lonely sound that echoed off the stone walls. "We should go," Margaret said finally. "Get our horses. Start for home." But Iris did not move. She stood looking at her mother in the moonlight, and her face held 1,000 questions. "Why did you do it?" Iris's voice carried genuine confusion. "Not tonight. That I understand. But back then, after Pa died, why hunt them? Why couldn't you let it go?" Margaret had asked herself that question 1,000 times over 10 years, had never found an answer that satisfied. "Because I was drowning." Each word came with visible effort. The pain was so deep, I couldn't see past it. "Your father was the best thing that ever happened to me, the only person who looked at the iron rose and saw Margaret underneath. When he died, I felt like I died too. And hunting his killers, killing them one by one, it made me feel alive again. Made me feel like I was doing something instead of just drowning in grief." She looked up at the stars, countless and cold. "It was wrong. I know that now. I knew it even then deep down. But sometimes, when you're hurting badly enough, wrong feels like the only option." "And then I was born. And then you were born." Margaret smiled despite the tears on her cheeks. "And suddenly, I had a reason to live that wasn't revenge. I had you, this tiny, perfect person who needed me, who depended on me, and I realized I had a choice. Keep being the Iron Rose and doom you to that life, or become someone new, someone better." "So you lied." "I did. I buried the truth so deep I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. Almost believed that Margaret Sutton was who I had always been." She reached out hesitantly, and when Iris did not pull away, she took her daughter's hand. "But you deserve better than lies. You deserve the whole truth, even the ugly parts, especially the ugly parts." Iris's fingers tightened around Margaret's. "The whole truth is you're my mother. You raised me. You loved me. You protected me. And yes, you've killed people. And some of those killings might have been wrong, and you carry that weight every day. But that doesn't erase the good. It just makes you human." They stood hand in hand under the stars, 2 women bound by blood and choice, and the complicated truth of what family means. Not perfection, not purity, just love and effort, and the willingness to keep trying, even when trying is hard. "I shot a man tonight," Iris said quietly. "I'll carry that now. That weight you talked about. I know, I'm sorry. Don't be. You taught me to protect myself, to stand up when standing up matters. Tonight mattered. She looked at her mother with eyes that seemed older than 18. Will it get easier? The memory of it. No. Margaret's honesty was absolute. But you'll learn to carry it, and I'll help you. We'll help each other. They retrieved their horses and began the long ride home to Copper Ridge. They did not speak much during that ride, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who had said the important things, and now needed time to let those words settle. Dawn found them halfway home, riding through country that was achingly beautiful in the early light. The desert stretched in all directions, painted in shades of gold and amber, alive with the morning songs of birds and the whisper of wind through mesquite. What happens now? Iris asked as they stopped to water the horses at a small spring. We go home. We rebuild. We figure out how to live with truth instead of lies. Will people accept us when they know about the Iron Rose? Margaret considered. Some will, some won't. Sheriff Cole knows, and he helped us anyway. Dutch knows, and he rode with us. There are good people who understand that the past doesn't have to define the future. And the ones who don't understand, we live with that too. We can't control what others think of us, Iris. We can only control who we choose to be going forward. 3 months later, Copper Ridge had settled into a new normal. Word of the Fort Defiance incident had spread as such things always do in small towns. Everyone now knew that quiet widow Margaret Sutton had once been the legendary Iron Rose. Reactions varied. Some people avoided her crossing to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. Others, especially the older men who remembered the wild days, treated her with a respect bordering on reverence. A few, like Elizabeth Moore from the general store, simply didn't care. As Elizabeth had said bluntly, "You saved my boy from pneumonia 3 years back. I don't give a damn what your name used to be." Margaret no longer taught at the church school. The pastor, while not unkind, had gently suggested that someone with her history might not be the best influence on young children. Instead, she taught private classes at her ranch for the daughters of families who wanted their girls to learn more than just household skills. Reading, arithmetic, and also self-defense. How to throw a knife, how to read dangerous situations, how to survive in a world that was not always kind to women alone. She kept one colt, now not both. The second she had taken to the blacksmith in Tucson, a man who asked no questions, and had him melt it down and reforge the metal. From it, he crafted a beautiful medical scalpel with a handle engraved with Iris's initials. Iris had apprenticed herself to Doc Pemberton, the town physician. She assisted with surgeries, learned to set bones and deliver babies, studied from the doctor's medical texts late into the night. The shooting still haunted her, sometimes nightmares that woke her gasping. But Margaret was always there, ready to sit with her daughter until the fear passed and sleep could return. They had become a team mother and daughter, both carrying scars, but stronger for having survived the wounding. On a cold December morning, a rider approached the ranch. Margaret's hand moved instinctively toward the colt at her hip before she recognized Dalton Reed's scarred face. He rode slowly, hands visible and empty, every gesture designed to show he meant no harm. Margaret stepped out onto the porch, Iris emerging to stand beside her. Reed dismounted and approached on foot, stopping a respectful distance away. "Mrs. Sutton," he said. "Miss Sutton, I'm not here for trouble." "Then why are you here?" Margaret's hand stayed near her gun. Reed pulled a leather pouch from his saddlebag and held it out. "This is my share from Calhoun's last legitimate business deal, $300. I want you to give it to Miss Iris, for medical school or whatever she needs." Iris stepped forward, surprised. "Why would you do that?" Reed's scarred face creased into something that might have been a smile. "Because I've spent my whole life working for men like Calhoun, taking money to do things I knew were wrong, telling myself it was just business, just survival, but watching you two, watching what you're willing to sacrifice for each other," he shook his head, "made me think maybe there's a better way." Margaret took the pouch, felt the weight of coins inside. "You served 3 months for kidnapping. Could have been years. Judge took into account that I didn't hurt the girl, that I testified against Calhoun." Reed met her eyes. Your testimony helped too. You told the court I let Iris go when you asked, that I showed restraint. You could have painted me as a monster, but you didn't. That meant something. People aren't just one thing, Margaret said quietly. Not heroes or villains, just people making choices. You made a bad choice following Calhoun, but you made a good choice letting Iris go. One doesn't erase the other, but both matter. Reed nodded slowly. I'm heading to California. Heard they need men to work the railroad's honest work. Figured I'd try that for a while. See if I can be someone different than who I've been. He mounted his horse, then paused. The iron rose. The stories say you were the fastest gun alive, but that's not what I'll remember. I'll remember a woman who could have killed me a dozen times but chose mercy instead. That takes more strength than any fast draw. He rode away, disappearing into the winter morning. Iris looked at the pouch in her mother's hands. Will you give it to me for school? Do you want it, money earned from kidnapping you? Iris thought about it. Yes, because he's trying to change. And that money, it came from legal work Calhoun did. It's clean. And if I use it to become a doctor to heal people, then something good comes from something bad. That seems right. Margaret smiled and handed over the pouch. That seems right to me, too. That evening they sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the desert. The winter air was cold, but they had blankets and coffee and each other's company. Ma, Iris said quietly, tell me about Pa, the real stories, not the sanitized ones you used to tell when I was little, the truth. So Margaret did. She told Iris about Samuel Garrett, the quiet marshal who believed in justice without vengeance, who had courted the Iron Rose with patience and poetry, who had seen past her guns to the woman underneath, who had died trying to save strangers because that was who he was, someone who could not walk away from people in need. She told Iris about their wedding, small and simple, just the two of them and a circuit preacher. About the 3 months they had together before death took him. About how he used to leave letters for her before dangerous assignments, letters full of love and hope and faith that she could be better than her reputation. He believed in me, Margaret said, even when I didn't believe in myself. And when he died, I forgot that belief. But then you came along and you gave me something to believe in again. Iris leaned against her mother's shoulder. I wish I'd known him. You do know him. You have his heart, his kindness, his belief that the world can be healed one person at a time. That's him living on in you. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged. Margaret thought about the guns hanging openly on the wall inside, now no longer hidden. About the journal she had started writing, her own account of the Iron Rose years, not glorifying them, but not hiding them either. About the daughter beside her who knew the worst and chose to stay anyway. The past would always be there, a shadow that could never be completely escaped. 48 men dead by her hand. Thomas Devereaux shot in circumstances she would never be completely certain about. Choices made in anger and grief that could not be unmade. But the future was still unwritten. And in that future, Margaret saw a daughter who would become a doctor healing instead of hurting. Saw a small ranch where women learned to protect themselves and be strong. Saw a life built not on lies but on complicated, difficult truth. The Iron Rose was retired. Margaret Sutton had taken her place. Not perfect, not pure, but trying. Always trying to be better than yesterday, to grow from mistakes instead of being consumed by them. Iris stood stretching. I'm going to write to the medical college in San Francisco. Doc Pemberton says he'll write a letter of recommendation. You're really going to do it? Leave Copper Ridge for a while. To learn. But I'll come back. This is home. Your home. She smiled. Besides, someone has to make sure the Iron Rose stays retired. After Iris went inside, Margaret remained on the porch looking up at the infinite stars. She thought of Samuel, hoped he could see her, now hoped he would understand the choices she had made. The violence tonight, yes, but also the 10 years of peace before it. The daughter raised with love. The attempt, however flawed, to be better. She wore his badge still kept in a drawer, now a reminder of the law he had served and the justice he had believed in. Next to it, her journal, where she wrote the truth about the Iron Rose, so that someday when she was gone, people might understand. Not excuse, not forgive, just understand. In the house, lamplight glowed warm and golden. Her daughter studied medical texts at the kitchen table, preparing for a future that would be better than the past. And on the wall, one Colt revolver hung in its holster, kept clean and ready, but hoping never to be needed. Iron and rose, strength and gentleness, violence and healing. Not opposites, but complements, two halves of a whole person, learning to live with all her contradictions. Margaret Rose Thornton Sutton sat under the desert stars and felt for the first time in 17 years something like peace. Not the peace of forgetting, not the peace of absolution, but the peace of acceptance, of knowing who she was, all of her, and choosing to keep moving forward anyway. The night deepened. The desert sang its ancient songs. And the woman who had been the Iron Rose went inside to be simply a mother preparing hot chocolate for her daughter, helping her study, living the quiet life that was more precious than any legend. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The whispers would continue. The past would never fully release its grip. But tomorrow would also bring the sunrise and coffee and the sound of her daughter's laughter and the endless possibility of becoming slowly and imperfectly the person Samuel had always believed she could be. That would be enough. It would have to be. And somehow, sitting in the warm kitchen with Iris chattering about medical procedures, Margaret found that it was more than enough. It was everything.